when more people, and this was largely after Henry Ford developed his Model T and more people could afford a car, there began to be, first quietly and then a clamor for better roads. And people were listening. The AAA started right around the turn of the century. As early as 1902, they had called for better roads. But nobody could figure out who should do these better roads. Should it be a government responsibility, as some people thought, or should it be privately done? In the late 19th century, there were a lot of toll roads, and those were done by private groups, usually of merchants and so on, and that helped develop some of the farm-to-market roads to be in better shape. They would be graveled, and that was an improvement. Really, the only improvements to roads out in the rural areas were either gravel or an early form of macadam, which didn't hold up well with the freeze-thaw of places like Indiana. So Carl Fisher came along in about 1912. Carl Fisher, entrepreneur, always with the new ideas. So his idea was the automobile manufacturers and people who had interest in the automobile should kick in money for materials to improve the roads. And they would get, his idea was that the counties and towns would supply the labor and tools, but if they came up with the money to supply the materials to improve the roads and maybe take out some of the curves, build new bridges, something like that, then they would go for it, which was not a bad idea. So he asked all the Indiana car manufacturers, of which there were many at the time. They were all for it. He knew that the guy he really had to get on board was Henry Ford, and Henry Ford wasn't interested. Henry Ford said, "No, the government should pay for these roads out of our taxes." That was his belief, and to the end of his days, that was his belief. He never offered a penny to the Lincoln Highway development at all. His son did, interestingly. Edsel Ford was even on the board of the Lincoln Highway Group. Carl Fisher's enthusiasm was very contagious, so he managed to get people going on it. So he was kind of chugging along, but still, his idea was, this was 1912, and the Pan-Pacific Exposition, a World's Fair essentially, was going to go on in 1915 in San Francisco. So that was going to be the westward destination. And the East End was, of course, New York, naturally, the biggest city in the country. So that made sense. He didn't have a clue what the route would be in between, but he knew he would find a route. The idea was to get the idea going. And he called this the Coast-to-Coast Rock Highway. Not an exciting name. So it was kind of chunking along, and he was getting money for it, but how are they ever going to get this done by 1915? When he went up to talk to Henry Joy, who was the head of Packard, a more luxurious car than the Model T was, and was kind of into the idea. His father had been an admirer of Lincoln and had actually known him, so his son grew up with that. And Lincoln was his hero, his idol. Henry Joy said, yes, there should be a highway named for Lincoln because it will unify the country, which is what Lincoln was all about. So that became an exciting idea to him. And he, in his own way, could be every bit as passionate as Carl Fisher, just not so flamboyant. He was a much more practical guy. So he went for it, and getting Henry Joy on board was a really big deal. And of course, Fisher, once he got it rolling and really rolling and looking like it was going somewhere, began to let go of the reins. And by 1915, it was pretty much the baby of Henry Joy. So they got it going. They did it that way, the subscription way. They set up sections of paved road right outside town to show what they could do and encourage the town to continue it onward. The Ideal Mile was built in Indiana up between Dyer and Schererville, and that was a precursor of our modern highways, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. But to this day, it looks like a modern road, a road of today. It is 4-lane, divided, it has lights, it has curbing and the whole bit, much like our interstates today. And this was built in the teens to show what ultimately the Lincoln Highway should be. So they always were thinking along the lines of improving the Lincoln Highway once they got it going. The route, well, Carl Fisher went west and took his Hoosier automobile guys with him. And they came up with a route, more or less, that became the Lincoln Highway. It, of course, didn't hit Indianapolis at all, even though that's where Carl Fisher was from, and he was the main instigator. But once things got going, it made sense to use what there was existing. Not much once you get past Chicago. So they used parts of the Lincoln Highway. For example, out west are the Overland Trail, which went to Oregon. Part of it. So they used part of that, and with the ultimate goal of reaching San Francisco. Here in Indiana, they used parts of several old Indian trails, the Sauk Trail for one. So that's why they went up. You think, well, why didn't the Lincoln Highway go straight across Indiana from Fort Wayne to Valparaiso? Instead, it went northwestward up through Goshen and Elkhart, South Bend, LaPorte, and then back down to Valparaiso. Well, there were existing roads then, and those roads were not great roads, but they were existing, and they were an established route. There was no road all the way across Indiana at a time except a railroad. Now later on, by the 20s, there was a dirt road, but it was a dirt road, and it was bad, so they didn't, and it was only in patches. In the 20s, they said, well, this is really the straighter way. So they did, in the 20s, improve and make it continuous, that road that essentially followed the railroad, and that became US 30 in Indiana. Now the Lincoln Highway followed US 30, then was moved to US 30 in Indiana, and much of the east, the Lincoln Highway is on US 30, or at least the older version of it. Old US 30 exists to this day in Indiana, and you can indeed follow the Lincoln Highway mostly throughout Indiana on both routes. And it goes through, much like the other, goes through a lot of small towns, and you'll find in those small towns a lot of names: Lincoln Way, Lincoln this, Lincoln that. Those are fast disappearing, but a lot of them are still there. Yeah, these roads, the Lincoln Highway route was the first thing to establish, and they did. Henry Joy and his partners did this, and his idea was to go as straight as possible. Here in Indiana, even though they didn't go straight across Indiana, that was simply because no good road existed at all directly between Fort Wayne and Valparaiso, where they're going to start heading out of the state. So they took what roads there were, and none of them were paved, as I mentioned earlier. These roads were not paved once you got out of town. There might be some brick or some paving block or some wood blocks or some gravel out of town for a while, but when you got out in the middle of the county between towns, it was probably dirt, and this had to be changed. So that was the idea at first. First establish a route. Okay, we got the route, and we have something resembling roads, the entire route, and something resembling should be taken literally. But then the whole point was to improve these roads eventually. So gradually, as the Lincoln Highway caught fire, and it sure did. The big thing, not only when you're establishing a highway on which people will go a very long distance, a whole new concept, was there had to be a support infrastructure. So not only did the highway itself, the road surface itself, have to be improved, and that isn't just paving, that's also drainage and things like that. But you also had to have that support system. You had to have places for people to eat. You had to have places for people to spend the night. Towns thought, hey, if they come into town, they'll eat at our restaurants and maybe buy supplies at our businesses. So a lot of, especially the smaller towns, larger ones too, would set up auto camps on the outside of town. Sometimes they would use county seats, or the towns where the county fairs were located, they would use the county fairgrounds and set up a portion of it for an auto camp. Creating these amenities led to, first there were the auto camps, and then there were cabins. Let's make them a little better. And then, of course, motels came along, starting in about the 1930s, when they began to see that they could save money by attaching all these cabins in one clump. Usually these were only about 5 or 6 units at a time, the early motels. Of course, later they got to be quite large. But all this infrastructure had to be developed as well. And meanwhile, the roads were getting better and better. By the time of the late 1920s, when the Lincoln Highway rerouted itself in Indiana onto US 30, that road was entirely paved the whole way. concrete was very new as a road surface. It was a building material in the early 20th century, but use as a road surface was very unusual. That's why the ideal mile in your diary is so unusual too, because that's concrete, and that was not used as a road material very much at that early date. But that began to be the material of choice. It went from macadam, which is just loose stones kind of pressured together, and then later that was oil, and that ultimately became asphalt paving, which was the other paving material of choice. Of course, concrete holds up better, and you'll still see sections of the Lincoln Highway and other early highways in Indiana that have been bypassed, and you'll still see those, and they're in excellent shape. You know, one thing the Lincoln Highway is responsible for, in a way, is our interstate system, which was really largely the brainchild of President Eisenhower. Way back, they'd just gone through World War I. He was part of an expedition that traveled the Lincoln Highway all the way out to the coast to see really how this would be logistically. They were thinking in terms of what a road system would do to help with getting things from here to there. That's what Army logistics are all about, and in a quick manner. In other words, would it be better maybe to take convoys on roads rather than load everything up on trains? I guess that was the thinking at the time. So they made this long expedition in 1919 and went all the way out to the West Coast. And there's countless photographs of these Army guys being encamped outside towns and being welcomed by towns and so forth, because that sort of lent some legitimacy to the Lincoln Highway too, which was by that time beginning to be pretty exciting. I would say 20s and 30s was its big heyday. So I guess Eisenhower always kept that in mind. And one thing that Germany really was ahead of the world on was its highway system. Hitler had created the Autobahn in Germany, a superhighway system, and Eisenhower saw that, and he had a thought in his mind way back to the Lincoln Highway. He said, this is what our country needs, is a whole system of interstates that don't go through the towns but around them, but that would link major population areas one to another and be able to get people and equipment and whatever is necessary to and from a certain place fast. And so he got his engineers together and started our interstate system, which was largely built in the 50s and 60s.
Johnny O'Connor bought an automobile. He took his sweetheart for a ride one Sunday. Johnny was togged up in his best Sunday clothes. She nestled close to his side. Things went just dandy till he got down the road. Then something happened to the old machinery. That engine got his goat, off went his hat and coat. Everything needed repairs. He'd have to get out and get under to fix his little machine. He was just dying to cuddle his queen.